Silu, and I teach here at the university and am part of the Center for Jewish Studies faculty. And it's my privilege to moderate our opening session with these very intriguing papers. Our first speaker is Chad Allen Goldberg, who is professor of sociology. Can you hear me, by the way? Professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and simultaneously affiliated with the Center for German and European Studies, the George L. Massey Lawrence A. Weinstein Center for Jewish Studies, and the George L. Massey Program in History. He's published at least 2 award-winning books. I may not be aware of all of them, both at the University of Chicago. The first, Citizens and Paupers, Relief, Rights, and Race, from the Freedmen's Bureau to Workfare, University of Chicago, 2007. And more recently, Modernity and the Jews in Western Social Thought at Chicago, 2017. His talk this afternoon, 2 cheers for alienation. Why stabilization of hyphen, I have to give you the diacritics here. Why stabilization of hyphens may not be entirely bad for the Jews. Chad.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Melissa, for a very kind introduction. I want to thank Bruno for inviting me to be part of this very interesting conference today and tomorrow. I want to thank the Jewish Studies staff for making it so easy to get here and to stay here in Minneapolis. It's really a pleasure, both professional and personal pleasure, to be here today and to participate in this conference with you. The sociological analysis of the hyphen in the context of American Jewish history, wrote philosophy professor Beryl Lang in 2005, has been the subject of 2 conflicting theories. Following American sociologist Stephen M. Cohen, Lang dubbed these theories the straight line theory and the stabilization theory. The straight line theory suggests that hyphenated identities are a transitional and transitory step toward complete assimilation, and thus to a more unified identity. According to this theory, Jewish American is merely a way station, to use Louis Wirth's expression, on the way to the eventual disappearance of the Jewish half of the hyphenated pair. The Jewish American, or more precisely his or her descendants, will eventually become American to core. In contrast, the stabilization theory proposes that hyphenated identities may endure because at some point the generation-linked erosion in Jewish identification comes to an end. As Lang put it, the stabilization theory finds in the assertion of the hyphenated identity the possibility, even the promise, of a steady state in which both sides of the hyphen survive together with it. So this paper addresses 2 related questions that emerge from this debate. First, should we expect the hyphenated Jew to disappear in the early 21st century, as the straight line theory predicts, or to endure, as the stabilization theory contends? In contrast to recent work by sociologist Jeffrey C. Alexander, which argues that the hyphenated mode of civil incorporation has given way to a multicultural mode, and that the hyphenated Jew has consequently disappeared from the American scene, I will argue that there are good reasons to expect the return of the hyphenated Jew. And second, if this assessment is correct, how should we evaluate this outcome? Is the persistence of the hyphen good or bad for the Jews? And here, building on some recent work that was published a couple of years ago that Melissa mentioned, I will give a qualified endorsement of the hyphen, arguing that hyphenated identities deserve 2 cheers, to borrow Ian Forster's formulation about democracy and Irving Kristol's well-known formulation about capitalism. In his monumental 2006 work, The Civil Sphere, Alexander examined the Jewish question in relation to 3 ideal typical modes by which outgroups are incorporated into the civil sphere. The first of these modes of incorporation is assimilation, which Alexander defined as the separation of the person who belongs to an outgroup from the stigmatized qualities that distinguish the outgroup from the core group. This separation is usually accomplished by splitting private and public life. In Alexander's words, members of primordially stigmatized groups could participate in the discourse and institutions of civil society insofar as they completely shed these identities upon entering the public domain. Assimilation permits the members of outgroups to be evaluated positively, thereby expanding their opportunities for civic participation, but it fails to challenge the negative evaluation of their outgroup qualities. This delicate and tense balancing between negatively evaluated qualities and positively evaluated persons, Alexander has argued, makes assimilation a highly unstable mode of incorporation that may be pushed backward toward new forms of exclusion or forward toward alternative modes of incorporation such as hyphenation and multiculturalism. The hyphenated mode of incorporation is more open to and accords more positive recognition to foreign or outsider particularities than does the assimilative mode of incorporation. And in this respect, Alexander regards it as a progressive alternative. Nevertheless, he argued hyphenation remains fraught with challenges for Jews and other outgroups. Alexander distinguished strong and weak versions of this hyphenated approach, and the strong version, exemplified by the notion of America as a melting pot, foreign particularities are blended with core identities into a higher synthesis, a new collectivity typically described in national and/or racial terms, which is supposed to transcend the particular identities of core and outgroup alike. Jewish qualities, like those of other outgroups, are in this way eventually absorbed, obliterated, and rendered invisible. Insofar as the new race forged in the American melting pot exhibits only the unique particularity of America itself, the strong version of hyphenation is consistent with the straight line theory. In the weak version of hyphenation, ethnic particularities remain evident and pronounced. Hyphenated identities are thus apparently stabilized. However, this outcome does not indicate equal valuation of core and outsider qualities. On the contrary, Alexander wrote, significant rank ordering of primordial qualities remains in this situation. The qualities of excluded groups are seen as complementary, but still inferior to those of the core group. Alexander concluded that the hyphenated mode of incorporation, like the assimilative mode, provides a highly unstable basis for the expansion of civil solidarity, and therefore is liable to be pushed backward to assimilation and even to exclusion, or else forward to what he called the multicultural mode of incorporation. Now, multiculturalism, of course, has lots of different meanings to different people. As Alexander conceived it, the multicultural mode of incorporation goes further and differs markedly from the assimilative and hyphenated modes of incorporation because it entails the positive evaluation of outgroup qualities such as minority racial status, peripheral national origins, or marginalized religion. These primordial qualities, previously thought to disqualify their bearers from civil inclusion, become reinterpreted as representing variations on the sacred qualities of civility. Although Alexander denied an inevitable developmental or evolutionary logic to the civil incorporation of outgroups, his account of the American Jewish experience proceeds from assimilation to hyphenation and then to multiculturalism. Following the dilemmas and failures of the assimilative and hyphenated modes of incorporation earlier in the 20th century, Alexander argued the instabilities of Jewish American incorporation were pushed in a multicultural direction from the 1960s onward. Simply put, these are his words, Christian Americans began to find Jewish qualities attractive in themselves. And perhaps in his argument here about the multicultural mode of incorporation, there's a parallel we might want to explore in the discussion to the kind of identification that Sarah describes in the French context in her book, The Figural Jew. But I'll leave that for discussion. Alexander's evidence for this thesis was mostly drawn from popular culture, including a close reading of Jewish self-representations by Phil Roth and Woody Allen, as well as demographic trends in the United States like intermarriage. However, Alexander cautioned rather than leading to a steady state, the multicultural mode of incorporation was unstable in its own way, giving rise to new problems of boundary definition and identity. Christian America's multicultural embrace of Jewish qualities, he argued, allowed confident assertions of Jewish difference such as a return to more traditional religious practices in non-Orthodox synagogues, the growth of Jewish day schools, and the creation of Jewish studies departments and programs like the one here. However, Alexander pointed out, if difference can be recognized only when there is increasing solidarity between core and outgroup, it should not be surprising that even as they begin to cultivate their differences, Jewish Americans would come to feel more like non-Jewish Americans, and the latter more like them. As a result, Jewish assertions of difference were paradoxically accompanied by Jewish anxiety about the continuing viability of Judaism in America. Now, to return to the terms with which I began this paper, I submit that Alexander's treatment of the Jewish question in America is a new version of the straight line theory. To be sure, Alexander did not predict the complete assimilation of American Jews or the complete loss of Jewish qualities, but he denied that the hyphenated mode of incorporation can be stabilized. He described the hyphenated incorporation of Jews as a failed utopian project, and he claimed that for American Jews since the 1960s, hyphenation has been supplanted by a multicultural mode of incorporation. As a corollary, Alexander saw American Jews moving away from the divided identity that some would say is inherent in hyphenation toward a more unified identity. In the assimilationist version of straight line theory, a unified self is achieved when the Jewish aspect of Jewish American identity withers away. In Alexander's version, multiculturalism unifies the Jewish self in a different way, not by obliterating the Jewish element, but by creating, in his words, thicker and deeper forms of mutual identification between core group Christian Americans and out-group Jewish Americans. The identities of once marginalized groups, Alexander argued, come to be viewed both as legitimately and importantly different from the core groups, and at the same time as fundamentally the same. And indeed, in Alexander's account, it is precisely this mutual identification that creates anxiety about the loss of a distinctive Jewish identity. This is quite different from the anxiety that stems from a kind of internalized culture conflict. So what are we to make of this? I would say that 13 years after the publication of Alexander's book, his discussion of the Jewish question in America appears overly sanguine. America's erstwhile love affair with Jewish qualities has taken a startling and disturbing turn. As journalist Jennifer Rubin wrote in the Washington Post in October 2018, anecdotal and statistical evidence suggests that anti-Semitism is currently on the rise in the United States. This trend is epitomized by the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where neo-Nazis chanted, "Jews will not replace us," as well as the murderous assault on Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, which the Anti-Defamation League described as likely the deadliest attack on the Jewish community in the history of the United States. And now, it pains me to add this to the text of my original talk, and now the murderous April 27th assault on a Chabad synagogue near San Diego, California, exactly 6 months to the day after the Tree of Life attack. In its 2018 audit of anti-Semitic incidents, the Anti-Defamation League found that the number of anti-Semitic incidents was nearly 60% higher in 2017 than 2016, the largest single-year increase on record, and the second highest number reported since the Anti-Defamation League started tracking incident data in the 1970s. The US Federal Bureau of Investigation reported that hate crime incidents targeting Jews and Jewish institutions in the US spiked about 37% in this same time period between 2016 and 2017. So if you discount the ADL's data, you have the FBI data, which shows a similar kind of trend. These trends may reflect the problems of boundary definition and identity that Alexander associated with multiculturalism, but I think in a quite different way than he anticipated. Rather than evincing Jewish anxiety about the continuing viability of Judaism in America, rising anti-Semitism reflects non-Jewish anxiety about the continuing viability of America when core group and out-group identities are viewed as fundamentally the same, in his words, hence the chant of Jews will not replace us. Leave aside whether and how rising anti-Semitism may be explained, at least in part, as a reaction against the multiculturalist trends that Alexander described more than a decade ago. I simply wish to make the point that with this rise, The thicker and deeper forms of mutual identification that Alexander described between America's historically Christian core group and its Jewish minority will be harder to sustain. Sociologist Louis Wirtz is perhaps a better guide than Alexander to the relationship between America's core group and its Jewish minority under these circumstances. Now, Louis Wirtz is typically seen as an assimilationist, but his views on this question were not entirely consistent, and his 1928 book, The Ghetto, proposed an alternative to the straight-line theory. The book acknowledged that a variety of social processes promoted the assimilation of Jews into American society. However, Wirtz suggested those processes were partly offset by countervailing forces, including anti-Semitism, new immigration, and the unintended reconcentration of Jews in new neighborhoods, which tended to reproduce ghettoization even in the New World, even in America. Thus, he wrote, the rise and decline of the ghetto seems to be a cyclical movement. In the 21st century, the countervailing forces that Wirtz identified continue to operate, at least to some extent. Anti-Semitism, I have suggested, is on the rise. Although there is no new Jewish immigration on the horizon, Jews from the former Soviet Union and their offspring accounted for roughly 1/10 of the US Jewish population in 2013. And lastly, Jews continue to be heavily concentrated in physical space, in urban areas, for instance, and in particular geographical regions of the country, as well as in social space, defined in terms of cultural and economic capital. Freud suggested that the persistence of the ghetto within a Gentile world and the Jews' recurring emergence from and retreat to it produced cultural friction internalized by Jewish individuals. In contrast to Alexander's expectation of ever thicker and deeper mutual identification, Wirtz was skeptical that such cultural friction could be entirely eliminated. Even in America, he wrote, the Jew, quote, lived on the periphery of two worlds, and not fully in either. His self is divided between the world that he has deserted and the world that will have none of him, unquote. Now, I think that's putting things too strongly today. Most contemporary American Jews have not deserted the Jewish world, and they're far more integrated into American institutions now than in 1928 when Wirtz wrote those words. Nevertheless, Wirtz's description of living in two worlds, though not fully in either, may increasingly come to describe the contemporary experience of American Jews as recent developments lend new salience to the kind of cultural friction that he described. Now, if in Alexander's terms, a short-lived and unstable multicultural moment is now being pushed back towards something like hyphenation, how should we evaluate that situation? Is the persistence of the hyphen good or bad for the Jews, to put it in a very old-fashioned way? Historically, there have been two types of answers to this question, and describing these two types of answers, you'll hear some echoes of what Bruno said a moment ago. One interpretation has equated hyphenation with a divided self, with double consciousness and with self-alienation. The underlying assumption of this interpretation is that the two sides of the hyphen are in conflict. As sociologist Robert Park put it in the 1930s, the hyphenated individual straddles two not merely different but antagonistic cultures. Park's student Everett Stonequist elaborated the point this way, quote, when the standards of two or more social groups come into active contrast or conflict, the individual who is identified with both groups experiences the conflict as an acute personal difficulty or mental tension. The external conflict of the groups finds an echo in the mind of the individual concerned, unquote. So at a minimum, the internalized conflict is said to result in psychological maladjustment, insecurity, and emotional instability. The internalized conflict may express itself in the Jewish self-hatred exemplified by the Austrian philosopher Otto Weininger and analyzed by the German philosopher Theodor Lessing. In extreme cases, Stonequist argued the inner conflict may prevent psychological integration and lead to mental disorganization and even suicide. So in this interpretation, the hyphen signifies a divided self, which is an unhealthy self. Another interpretation has defended hyphenated identities by insisting in philosopher John Dewey's words, that the hyphen connects instead of separates. At a time when national political leaders like Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson equated hyphenation with disloyalty, Wilson likened the hyphen to a dagger that the immigrant was ready to plunge into the vitals of the republic. Dewey argued that hyphenation could promote the spirit of America if both were rightly understood. For Dewey, America was already international and interracial. The challenge was therefore not to exclude new foreign particularities from the civil sphere, but rather to prevent each element that enters into the civil sphere from isolating itself, trying to live off its past, and in Dewey's words, trying to impose itself upon other elements or keeping itself intact, and thus refusing to accept what other cultures have to offer. For him, that was the bigger danger. Dewey readily admitted that when hyphenism separates one people from other peoples, it was socially harmful. But Dewey proposed to welcome hyphenism, quote, in the sense of extracting from each people its special good, so that it shall surrender into a common fund of wisdom and experience what it especially has to contribute, unquote. In this way, each factor would be, again in Dewey's words, quote, transmuted into authentic Americanism, unquote. The novelty and value of Dewey's approach lay in articulating a new understanding of what the hyphen represents. Yet Dewey's interpretation of hyphenation seems, to me at least, uncomfortably close to what Alexander called the strong version, in which Jewish qualities, like those of other outgroups, are expected eventually to disappear into a higher synthesis. So I would like to conclude this paper by affirming the value of a third interpretation of the hyphen, a line of thought that includes economist and sociologist Thorstein Veblen, Robert Park, and others who suggested that even if the hyphen does divide, the divide itself isn't always entirely bad. Although many of their contemporaries regarded conflict as undesirable, these thinkers saw conflict in pragmatist fashion as a potential impetus to creativity. Veblen suggested as early as 1919 that the intellectual preeminence of Jews in the modern world stemmed from the conflict of cultures which they experienced as a result of their dispersion and migration. In his view, culture conflict imbued Jews with a healthy skepticism toward Jewish and Gentile conventions alike, which in turn was a primary requisite for creative contributions to intellectual life. Robert Park also envisioned the possibility that the marginal man, the individual who, as Louis Wirth put it, lived in two worlds but not fully in either, might become a creative agent, particularly through his leadership of nationalist or racial mass movements, among which Park explicitly included Zionism. In Old World Traits Transplanted, published in 1921, Park and his co-authors pointed to the Jewish Kehillah of New York, an experimental attempt from 1909 to 1922 to provide the city's burgeoning Jewish population with a unified and democratic community structure as a prime example of this kind of creative activity. Park's students, Louis Wirth and Everett Stonequist, also noted the creative potential of the divide itself. Wirth suggested that a person experiencing culture conflict, far from becoming a criminal, may develop into a prophet, a reformer, or a political leader. Those are Wirth's words. Similarly, according to Stonequist, Park's marginal man might strive to overcome his inner conflict by reconstructing the antagonistic ethnic relations that had produced it. Those marginal individuals who have the potentialities to reconstruct their personalities and return as creative agents, wrote Stonequist, not only adjust themselves, but also contribute to the solution of the conflict of races and cultures. So this third interpretation, I think, provides a unique perspective on hyphenation. It suggests that the hyphen divides and connects, and that the resulting tension is not altogether bad. To be sure, the inner conflicts that hyphenation entails can make it deeply unsatisfactory as a lived experience. The hyphenated Jew may yearn for a more unified self, but as Veblen, Park, and others remind us that cultural friction and dissatisfaction that hyphenation may also involve are at least partly compensated by the impetus it provides for creative insight and action. Thank you.
Thank you, Chad, very much. We're going to go on directly to the next paper, after which we will have a discussion led by my colleague Gary Cohen. It's a pleasure to welcome back to campus Sarah Hammerschlag. I think we had a conference or symposium next door at the Weizmann Art Museum, and I was her respondent, which gave me the opportunity to read that wonderful book, The Figural Jew. The full title, Politics and Identity in West and Post-War France, published by the University of Chicago in 2010. If you haven't had your chance to read it yet, I recommend it. I'm about to retire, so I will now have time eagerly to get on to another of your books, which I have not yet read, Broken Tablets, Levinas, Derrida, and the Afterlife of Religion, published in 2016 at Columbia. And as you may have noted in your program notes, she's also edited recently a collection called Modern French Jewish Thought, Writings on Religion and Politics. I somewhat abruptly left my sheet at my table, but I believe your topic includes the hyphen. May I steal your... Would you like me to read it? No. Religion and the Judeo-Christian hyphen, Levinas at the Colloque. Please welcome Sarah.
Thanks, Melissa, for that introduction, and it is really a pleasure to be back here. I think we decided it was 2014, so it was 5 years, and it's always a joy to come here, especially on such a beautiful day. Thanks also to Bruno for the invitation and to Nathan for all the organizational labor that went into this. So my paper is indeed entitled Religion and the Judeo-Christian Hyphen, Levinas at the Colloque, and I do have, a PowerPoint presentation, mostly just so that you can see the quotes. Let's see, it's something I think the computer got tired. Yeah.
Impatient.
I'm going to grab the glass first. Is it okay if we have a glass over? Yes, yeah. Yeah, that'd be sure. Sure. So I think this is my epigraph, and I think it will become more self-evident as the paper goes. The question of what a hyphenated identity has meant or could mean is at the very center of the project, of the Colloque des Intellectuels Juifs dans le Français, even if not explicitly. Meeting for the first time in 1957 and bringing together philosophers, poets, psychoanalysts, educators, journalists, and a diplomat, the Colloque sought explicitly to redefine the French Jewish intellectual. As André Neher put it in an essay prefacing the publication of the first issue of Proceedings, for a long time, the intellectual Jew was a figure for the lost child of Judaism. In every arena, he was at his task. On all the fields of battle, he struggled. In all the most worthwhile and perilous fights, he made up the avant-garde. And these were the arenas, the risks, the battles, where the most divisive of human responsibilities were engaged, except for one, that precisely of Judaism. So the project of the Colloque was in some sense to turn that paradigm around and put those energies towards re-understanding Jewish identity. The figure of the Jewish intellectual was itself inextricably French for Neher's audience, and the model of the past with which Neher wanted to contrast the present was that of the Dreyfusard. Against this fin de siècle figure, Neher suggested that the Colloque's project was to provide a new configuration to define French Jewish intellectuals. Instead of being intellectual despite their Judaism, they would seek ways to direct the intellectual powers cultivated by the university toward Judaism. The Colloque was to become the setting in which the products of these endeavors were displayed in all their variations and conflicts. From the very beginning, however, this project was more easily envisioned than enacted. For one thing, the Colloque brought together a group of diverse intellectuals for whom the very question of how to understand their own Jewishness was highly controversial. At two ends of the extreme were Edmund Flegg and Jean Val. I'm sure one of these pictures came out, but both men of the Dreyfusard generation, they nonetheless represented poles of what it meant to be a Jewish intellectual. Presiding over the first meeting was Flegg, for whom the project of reviving and defining French Judaism had been at the center of his life's work for well over 50 years. He was well ahead of the game. The elder Jewish statesman of the bunch, he presented the prophetic dream of peace among men as the Jewish dream par excellence. Jean Val was also a poet and a philosopher, but one who had hardly acknowledged his own Jewish heritage until forced to by the war. Val strongly resisted Flegg's impulse to attribute the prophetic dream of the unification of all humanity to Judaism, positioning himself consistently in the meeting's debates as a skeptic. Val replied to Flegg by pointing out that the Jews are not the only people or school of thought to carry such a message, raising the Stoics as another example. He remains, however, with a conundrum, Val, that he could no longer deny the fact of his Jewishness or treat it as an insignificant facet of his identity as he had before the war, and yet he could not name its positive content. Others at the meeting responded with different definitions, circling around the potential means of identification: race, nation, religion. The cultural attaché of Israel, Saul Levin, proposed defining Judaism as an order or an alliance, and Christianity as something like its derivative for those who don't want to comply with the obligation of belonging. At the very least, this solution would provide a narrative that subordinates Christianity to Judaism. Again, you have this desire to shift the paradigm, making it little more than Judaism's footnote. This alone would be a radical reversal. The history of modern French Judaism was, after all, determined by Christianity's priority from its post-revolutionary beginnings. It was by taking on a model of the confessional faith, the Assembly of Notables, and then the Sanhedrin helped to shape a definition of Judaism that made it a tradition paralleling French Catholicism and Protestantism. It was to contribute to the same goals as the nation's other religions that, quote, preach as we do, wrote Zadok Khan on his inauguration to the position of the nation's head rabbi in 1889. Quote, love of God, love of men, cult of work, and devotion to the fatherland. Here you have your notion of unity. If Judaism had something to prove in the 19th century, it was its religious core and its shared sensibility with the nation's other faiths. In other words, you could be fully French as long as Judaism was a confession. For Levin, it is this chapter of Judaism's history that had to be overcome in the post-war era of the Jewish state. He goes as far as suggesting that the period of European accommodation was itself just a passing stage, a mere detour, now outdated, whose historical manifestation was itself less authentic, less important to the future of Judaism, he suggests, than 18th century Hasidism. In rethinking the relation between Judaism and Christianity, the task was to recover Judaism's original position as the first biblical covenant, and with that, the primacy of its untainted wisdom. But is such a recovery possible? Can Judaism be freed from its modern hyphenated forms, and what would it mean to do so? In what follows, I want to consider the response to these questions by the most famous of the participants of the colloque, Emmanuel Levinas, who we've already heard a little bit about today. Levinas might seem like a figure who argued for the recovery of a pure Judaism. Indeed, he was among the most vocal at the colloquium. Here, I have a picture of him too. In calling for a return to Judaism's foundational texts. His Talmudic readings became the mainstay of the meetings over the years, and he regularly nagged its most reluctant members for failing to become acquainted with Hebrew's square letters. And in a remarkable note tucked away in the Central Zionist Archives, he made the following comment to Arnold Kaplan, Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress, to report on his experience at the first Colloque des Intellectuels Juifs Français. Not surprisingly, this is kind of the germ cell of my paper. It's this comment that I've been intrigued by since I found it. Within 48 hours, the inevitable Morano complexes, which all of us carry within us, even the least detached, had disappeared. This was even more precious than what was properly said. The colloque, it might seem, based on this comment, was itself something of a therapy for the overcoming of Judaism's dependence on Christianity, a chance to emerge from the overdetermination of Christianity in the self-definition of Judaism. Levinas, in his first comment at the colloquium, suggests even that the term religion is too stilted by Christianity to serve as a proper label for Judaism. Quote, Judaism is not a religion. The word does not exist in Hebrew, and I feel a certain discomfort whenever anyone tries to conform Judaism to religion, even the Christian religion, he said. This was during the conversational period of the Colloque. And yet, religion is exactly the term that Levinas uses more than any other to designate Judaism, and indeed its place in the post-war world. It appears 82 times in Difficult Freedom, including in the essay on Judaism entitled A Religion for Adults. It is crucial, too, to his philosophical project, functioning to name the ethical relation in totality and affinity. So how do we explain this seeming disjunction? The Colloque itself, I want to suggest, may provide us with an answer. Also among the attendees at the first meeting was the philosopher Vladimir Jankelevich. Like Wahl, Jankelevich was something of a reluctant Jew. Like Wahl, as well, it was the experience of persecution that sent him plumbing the depths of his identity in search of its Jewish core. To the interlocutors at the meeting who remained intent on trying to define Judaism in its own terms, to define it even outside of the bounds of religion, to release it from the vice of Christian judgment, Jankelevich makes this audacious comment. A comment which is interesting given the way in which we think about the paradigm of secularism these days. He seems in some sense to have been a little prophetic here. There's a subtle and secret influence of the Christian milieu in which we live which fascinates and penetrates us, which hypnotizes us. Is there not a temptation of the church among us, a fascination with what Christianity brings in the way of closure? I was deeply struck by the discourse according to which Judaism is not a religion, in any case not in the Christian sense of the term, but because Christianity is an extremely important phenomenon which penetrates us. How can we know if that which we do is not already Christianized? If we are not stunned by the head of the Gorgon of Christianity when we look in particular to define ourselves? Jankelevich makes this comment in the final session of the first conference. It was no doubt meant as something of a rejoinder to those who thought a pure recovery of Judaism, untainted by its connection to Christianity and the Western philosophical tradition, was in fact possible. Among those were André Neher, who in a seeming competition to determine who was more authentically Jewish, critiques Levinas for quoting from Plato to explain his method of reading Midrash. Neher instead suggests that you can find a better source in the Maharal of Prague, and says, the written text can escape us, it can be stolen, it was effectively the true possession of this text is in us, the oral law. That is it. Accepting to live as Jews, we have with us the word. Levinas' own answer to Jankelevich's question, how do we know that we are not stunned, and to Neher's criticism that he is himself too much in the thrall of the West philosophical tradition, comes by way of his first presentation at the Colloque, which is not until the Colloquium's second meeting, some 2 years later. What becomes clear in 1959, so at least 2 years later, is that Levinas, like Jankelevich, is in fact suspicious of the possibility that any pure recovery of Judaism can take place, even as he advocates for a return to the tradition's foundational text. So in other words, to return to the foundational text does not mean to necessarily to return to a pure Judaism. But this realization does not necessarily entail a defeat, nor does it return to the pre-war model by which Judaism attempts to prove its worthiness as a religion, by showing that it shares the same aims as its sister traditions. Rather, if the Colloque is to bring about a recovery from the Marano complex, it will not be by resisting the woman's gaze of Christianity, but by deflecting it back onto Christianity itself. We can see the roots of this project, actually, in Levinas' pre-war writings from the 1930s through to the 1950s, that is, in his fascination for Catholic figures, such as Paul Claudel and Jacques Maritain, for whom Judaism is always already a foil for Christianity. In 1938, Levinas published a little essay entitled L'essence spirituelle de l'antisémitisme d'après Jacques Maritain, in response to the 1937 collection Les Juifs, which is essentially a collection of essays mostly by Christians about the figure of the Jew. Although it includes a few essays by Jewish writers, it's primarily an attempt to thematize the role of the Jew for Christianity in light of current events. So in other words, to think about anti-Semitism and Zionism in the late 1930s through a Catholic theological lens. It's prefaced and concluded by Paul Claudel, to whom Levinas will devote 3 essays over the course of the next 35 years. And it's dominated by the message that in contradistinction to anti-Semitism, the Catholic Church recognizes the importance of Judaism, even in its blindness, stubbornness, and betrayal, as a remainder whose ultimate conversion is part of the Church's spiritual mission. Without accepting Maritain or Claudel's positions wholesale, Levinas is able to use their Christian gaze to illuminate something about Judaism which would otherwise not be visible. From Paul Claudel and Jacques Maritain's own tripartite description, one that already reads the Germans as Nietzschean blonde beasts, the church as a spiritual vehicle of the world's salvation, and the Jews as symbolic of an unredeemed relation to the world, estranged from it, but without salvation, Levinas recalibrates an alternative typology. For Maritain, the church is in the world but not of it, so strong that it suffers the world but is also free of it, already delivered. The Jews, in contrast, are also the people of God. They are, quote, starving for the kingdom, but did not accept him. Thus, they too are in the world, but not of it, but also not free in relation to it. They are, quote, riveted to it, submitted to it, enslaved by it. There is a, quote, passion of Israel, but it's not the passion of the church or of Christ, which redeems. It is the passion of the scapegoat, engaged in the earthly destiny of the world and its ways of sin. Quote, if the world hates the Jews, it's because it senses that they will always be supernaturally strangers. It's because it detests their passion for the absolute and the unbearable stimulation Israel inflicts upon it. It is the vocation of Israel that the world execrates. Christianity shares this estrangement with the Jews, but, quote, Christians have vanquished the world, whereas the Jews have not. This is why to become a Christian is a double victory for a Jew. His people triumph through him, writes Maritain. Those of you who know, his wife was in fact a Catholic who had converted, a Jew who converted to Catholicism. The text reads thus as a summons to Jews experiencing through anti-Semitism the burden of their faith to be lifted up by conversion. At the same time, Maritain, more so than Claudel, condemns anti-Semitism as anti-Christianity par excellence. For a Christian to be anti-Semitic, Maritain writes, is a pathological phenomenon which reveals an alteration of the Christian conscience when it becomes incapable of taking on its rightful responsibilities in the world and remaining faithful to the high demands of the Christian truth. So Levinas finds in Maritain an echo of the argument he'd already made in the 1930s, one that sees the Nazi rise to power as a rebellion against the failed promise of transcendence embodied in Christianity and in a doctrine of intellectual and spiritual freedom that the Enlightenment inherits from Christianity. Levinas and Maritain share the reading of anti-Semitism as a rebellion against transcendence, and Levinas is willing to read Christianity and Judaism as sharing a sense of estrangement from the world. He quotes Maritain on this point. However, instead of emphasizing contrast between the saved church and the condemned Jews, Levinas emphasizes a version of this dichotomy that sees Jewish worldliness as an attention to the good, an impatience for its manifestation, its appearance in this world. This then becomes, in later writings, the source of a two-pronged critique that reads Christianity as simultaneously too escapist and too mired in its syncretic and thus pagan roots, and Judaism as indeed the true tradition of passion. Thus, they are more literally the passion, and Jews as a people whose love of the world is such that it is dedicating itself to humanity's worldly salvation. With this flip in typology, Christianity comes to look too easy, too quick, on the one hand, to accept the world's accommodation to force, and too quick, on the other, to declare itself transcendent over it. So Christianity becomes condemned on two levels here. So in 1959, 22 years later, and across the abyss of the war, in the context of the Colloque, it is to Franz Rosenzweig that Levinas turns to show how this relationship between Judaism and Christianity can be reappropriated to Judaism's advantage without either claiming any pure return to Judaism's pure past or by conceding that Judaism will always be reconstituting itself in Christianity's shadow. So much has been made, of course, of Franz Rosenzweig's impact on Levinas, and I don't want to rehearse the various versions of the story here, but rather to reconsider Levinas' choice to provide a presentation on Rosenzweig at his first intervention at the Colloque, in light of the conundrums that marks its first meeting. So we've heard about the disputes of the first meeting, we've gone back and seen his writings on this idea of the Passion of Israel in the 1930s, and now we're looking at his first attempt to respond to the meeting itself. The choice does more than reveal the impact of the German Jewish thinker on Levinas' own project. One key move that Levinas makes in this expose is to restore the word religion to Rosenzweig's project, even as the word itself, as Levinas himself asserts, does not appear within the Star of Redemption. Thus, if Levinas was the most vocal of the interlocutors about the misfit between the term religion and Judaism at the first meeting, he's also the most vocal about its necessity in re-envisioning Judaism's role in the post-war context at the second meeting. It can be returned to Judaism, he suggests, not because it is proper to it, but by virtue of the very history of the term, indeed by virtue of its historic function in correlating Judaism with Christianity. Levinas presents his paper as a spiritual biography of Rosenzweig, and while this may function as a way to introduce Rosenzweig to those in the Colloque not yet familiar with the German Jewish thinker of the Weimar period, it more importantly emphasizes a method of re-engagement with the Jewish tradition that follows Rosenzweig's near conversion to Christianity, not literally, then figuratively. It is indeed Rosenzweig's path, quote, through Christianity that makes him exemplary for Levinas. Quote from Levinas, "The search through Christianity revealed Judaism to him," Levinas writes. "It is, quote, the double movement toward Christianity and then Judaism, which bears witness to the destiny of modern European Judaism." So if the cultural attaché of Israel, Saul Levin, wants to see the 19th century emancipatory moment for Judaism as a mere detour, Levinas comes back and, to the contrary, insists on its centrality to Judaism's future. For Levinas, it is perhaps even more important to Judaism that Christianity has been, quote, a determining force in Western life, now that Christianity, as he says famously, no longer a temptation for us. Here, the route to Judaism is not put in terms of recovery, but rather is accessed through modernity, through the personality of Rosenzweig, Levinas writes. "I want to search out, as we say today, one of the access points to Judaism, and even to religion, such as was possible for a Jew of our day, who, like all of you here, had read philosophy and history, knew sociology, biblical criticism, and Spinoza, and was aware of all the doubts they cast on the naive realism of the believer. I also want to show how today's Jew accedes to Judaism when he is recognized as a citizen of a modern state, as the accomplishment of his very vocation to be a human being." In Rosenzweig, he foregrounds two features. One, the idea that the afterlife of philosophy is religion, but is also not only its afterlife, it is both interior and posterior to philosophy. And two, that religion can serve as the site of resistance to the state, understood in Hegelian terms as the vehicle of history. These are the features that equally mark out religion as a sphere worth retaining, and a category that has since modernity encompassed both Judaism and Christianity. It therefore can now serve Judaism to define its vocation in the modern world by means of that very comparison, by means of the hyphen. It can also function with Christianity against what he calls here an atheism of the absolute indifferentism of tris tropique, an atheism for which all civilizations would be equal. So Levi-Strauss, in some sense, is the target of this comment and the target of a renewed interest in Judeo-Christianity, insofar as Levi-Strauss represents an interest in nations that are not European in an anthropological understanding of humanity. We can see already in this passage how and why Levinas will come to name the ethical relation of religion in totality and infinity, and the role that Judaism plays vis-a-vis this category. What does it mean for religion to be, quote, simultaneously posterior and anterior to philosophy and reason, as Levinas put it in the essay? It means, in Rosenzweig's terminology, that being in relation, God with man and man with world, precedes the totalization of human thought and philosophy. In totality and infinity, Levinas merely abstracts this statement so that it can be instantiated by the ethical relation, defining religion, quote, as the bond that is established between the same and the other without constituting a totality. Religion is posterior by virtue of the very path by which it comes to be realized. In Rosenzweig, this is figured as the work of redemption, but also the path that follows from philosophy's end, liberation from it. Religion, quote, does not precede philosophy, Levinas writes, summarizing Rosenzweig. It follows it. So Levinas finds in Rosenzweig a method by which the return to Jewish texts would not entail a pure concept of recovery or return. It would not entail divesting oneself of the categories that have been bestowed upon Judaism by means of its relationship with Christianity and with the philosophical tradition. It is by virtue of this path that religion comes to function as the site of resistance to the logic of the state, the means of resisting the temptation bestowed by modernity even upon the Jew. However, there's only one religion which concretely instantiates such a function that Levinas bestows upon the category of religion in the abstract and totality and infinity. The distinction between, quote, my political being and my religious being is the possibility of standing outside of history in the face-to-face relation, as Levinas described it in Totality and Infinity. As a tradition, however, this is Judaism's task, a task Levinas sees as urgent in the 20th century. It's at this point in his presentation that Levinas explicitly shifts from depicting Rosenzweig to advocating for a particular role for Judaism in the post-war context. It's also on this point that he meets the most resistance from his interlocutors. Judaism has, at its most ancient claims, its independence from history, he argues. This is, of course, an argument already in the Star of Redemption, developed by way of contrast with Christianity. Judaism lives in liturgical cyclical time, and Christianity is on the way with history. It is expansionist. From this notion, Levinas extrapolates the idea that Judaism's exemption from history entails a capacity to judge from a position of its externality. While from the perspective that, quote, exalts the judgment of history as the ultimate jurisdiction of every being, such a perspective is, quote, merely a subjective illusion. To be a Jew is to insist on the power of the will separate from history. In Totality and Infinity, Levinas calls this perspective eschatological vision, naming it not as Judaism, but as the idea of infinity, which, quote, delivers the subjectivity from the judgment of history to declare it ready for judgment at every moment. So in the discussion that follows Levinas' presentation at the colloquium, there's a great deal of confusion over the stakes of this claim that Judaism is somehow outside of history. For the journalist Rabi, who is himself something of a perennial skeptic, this seems to suggest that the problems of the modern world are not objects of concern for Judaism, a view he staunchly rejects. Others want to oppose Judaism's view of history from Christianity's, but insist that Judaism has nonetheless a robust notion of history, especially insofar as it is concerned for the world's redemption. Once again, Jean Val, troubled by the exceptionality that such a reading grants to Judaism, asks whether one has to be Jewish to, quote, live outside of history. And Levinas responds by clarifying his stance as one that does not depend on outcomes, on victors, but is nonetheless concerned about justice in the world. For Judaism, justice is defined against the totality of history. Here, in a sense, too, he explains what he resists arguing in Totality and Infinity, that Judaism as a tradition remains the only historical and thus necessary explanation of this possibility. He says, to judge history, you don't necessarily have to be Jewish, but it is Judaism, and by the style of its concrete existence, which can permit one's liberation from history, even if one is not oneself Jewish. It is perhaps the subsistence of Judaism, in the empirical sense of the term, that guarantees this freedom. This empirical presence is one of the coordinates of Western consciousness. Do you believe that anti-Semitism is simply one hate among the other classic hatreds of the human art, and not an essential hatred, hatred in itself? In this passage, Levinas has come full circle, back to the logic he encountered in Maritain and Paul Claudel. He's come back to a version of holy history in which there are not two, but three coordinates of religion: Judaism, Christianity, and paganism. It's the literal hatred of Judaism and its dangerous destiny in the face of that hatred that marks its role in history and its place in the post-war landscape. Along with his rehabilitation of the category of religion, we can see as well here that his response to Levi-Strauss and his anxiety about the changing global landscape in the post-colonial moment is no mere unfortunate oversight. It's baked into the pie. Already present in the 1930s, once he has, along with Claudel and Maritain, divided the world into Jews and pagans. Now, the pagans are no longer the Germans in this context. They're the colonized peoples. The irony is that his new concern that all cultures will be treated as equal is also the avenue of reconciliation between Judaism and Christianity, which can stand together as coordinates of religion against its impending absence in the world. In this, he tracks quite closely to the role that Judeo-Christian Hyphen has also played more broadly in both the European and American post-war context. It was a means of claiming the superiority of the West against the Cold War communist threat, but served equally to solidify a barrier against Islam and the traditions of colonized peoples across the globe. In this new formulation of an alliance between Judaism and Christianity, Judaism was quite firmly on the inside. To conclude then, there's no doubt that the Colloque des intellectuels juifs de langue française was from its very beginning a project concerned with thinking through the nature of hyphenated identity. one that quickly congealed around a debate between those who wanted a Jewish recovery that could extract the tradition from its Christian influence, who wanted to see emancipation and assimilation as a mere detour, and those who, as modern subjects, found the tradition to be archaic, even if, after the Nazi persecution, they could no longer deny their sense of belonging to it. Between these two poles, Levinas would chart a course that resisted both options. To recover from the Marano complex for Levinas would not entail a choice for secular modernity, or a pure, and to Levinas's mind, impossible return to the mythic Jewish past, but rather the reclamation of the very categories imposed upon Judaism by Christianity, so that in returning to the Midrash, as Levinas says in the first meeting, one can make it a living text. Quote, to read across the Midrash is not to falsify it. On the contrary, it is to reach from today. But this today only exists across history and in the function of all that this history wants to find there. All that this history wants to find there. In other words, in some sense, the whole history of anti-Jewish content is now, in some sense, to be read back into a reading of Midrash. What Christianity made of Judaism as a religion, as a people outside of history, as a scapegoat, has made its literal meaning transcend any metaphor. The Colloque therapy would not be a form of recovery from that imposition, but the very reclamation of that history as mission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we're going to have a period of discussion, led off with a response by Professor Gary Cohen, Professor Emeritus of History at this university, also a longtime member of the Center for Jewish Studies, the director of the Center for Austrian Studies. Gary's work has often involved study of multiculturalism, multinationalism, and I would point to one particular work that you might have noticed in your handouts, a book called The Politics of Ethnic Survival, Germans in Prague, 1861 to 1914, which reappeared in Czech translation in Prague by the Charles University. I can't give you the Czech title, sorry. I think it's on the handout, perhaps. And then later, in a paperback, second revised edition at Purdue University Press. His illustrious career, in a way, was crowned in a way that made us proud when the Czech Academy of Sciences awarded him a medal for historical sciences. So please welcome Gary to the podium.
Thank you, Melissa, for that generous introduction. My colleagues, Professors Schrader and Shawat, have asked me to offer no more than a short comment here, and I shall try to honor their request to keep my remarks to under 10 minutes. I promise that. I hope I can fulfill it. The papers of Chad Goldberg and Sarah Hammerschlag each address what should be central concerns for this conference. Although at first glance, the papers seem widely disparate in their primary concerns and their respective analytic stances. Professor Goldberg, a sociologist, addresses in broad theoretical terms the dynamics of hyphenated Jews' social positions and group identities in connection with their social relations and larger social structures. Professor Hammerschlag, a scholar of religion and literature, examines how a number of leading French Jewish intellectuals in the aftermath of World War II and the Shoah debated their relationship as Jews to the larger society and the relationship of Judaism to Christianity. The conference organizers, in fact, did us a considerable service, I think, in putting these two speakers together in this first panel. We need to understand both the situation of the hyphenated Jew as a matter of changing group relationships, larger social structures, and social trends, and the ideational and broader cultural content of a Jewish minority identity in the contemporary world. Too often, I think, social scientists and scholars in the humanities simply fail to engage with each other's work when they discuss minority or broader ethnic group identities, as if the other side didn't exist sometimes. The social relationships which members of minority groups have with each other and with the larger society are in fact mutually dependent with the cultural characteristics and values which constitute their group identities. Let me explain that. Cultural anthropologists recognized many decades ago that ethnic group identities are matters of process and social performance, rather than unchanging cultural essences supported by fixed social solidarities and group boundaries. Today, social scientists see a minority group identity as a loyalty or sense of group belonging that is affirmed by individuals or ascribed to them on the basis of sharing certain cultural traits, which are recognized as defining the group. We must remember that the defining cultural values or traits of modern ethnic groups are complex collections of values, customs, and attitudes that are constantly being created, modified, or abandoned. As the famed sociologist Craig Calhoun has noted, quote, "All traditions are created, none are truly primordial," end quote. Emmanuel Levinas and the other French Jewish intellectuals whom Hammerschlag discusses were debating just what defined French Jewish intellectuals as a group, and what distinguished them and their defining Jewish values from Christians and Christianity in France in the period after the Shoah. Sociologists, as Goldberg reminds us, have long believed that whether individuals adopt a minority identity and retain it depends to a great degree on their social relationships. Whatever the origins of the cultural characteristics which are taken as defining a group, those characteristics distinguish the group in society because individuals articulate a group loyalty on the basis of those traits. They attach social meaning to them, and they shape their actions and relationships according to that loyalty. And think instead of identity, it's really more, it's more easily understood and examined if we think loyalty and the practices which support it. The act or performance of group identification is what really matters. And the character of the social boundaries between the members of a particular ethnic group and the rest of society has critical importance. As the Norwegian anthropologist Fredrik Barth argued in a classic account as far back as the late 1960s, quote, "Ethnic identity implies a series of constraints on the kinds of roles an individual is allowed to play and the partners he or she may choose for different kinds of transactions," end quote. These constraints create social boundaries between the members of a particular group and the rest of the population, and they establish a social space for the expression, development, and if need be, the defense of group values, interests, and loyalties. Sociologists such as Lewis Wirth and others who have worked in the traditions of the Chicago School of Sociology have tried to explain the dynamics of group identification and the longer-term persistence or erasure of a distinct group identification by pointing to the preservation or erosion of distinctive group connections which exist in one or another sphere of individual social relationships, as contrasted to their wider social relations in other spheres. Now, in my short remaining time, let me pose a few questions about the two papers which follow from the broad conceptual framing I've just sketched. First, for Chad Goldberg. You critique notions of multicultural incorporation of Jews like that of Jeffrey Alexander because they posit ultimately an end of hyphenation, which in fact amounts to a new version of the old straight-line theory of seemingly inevitable assimilation, a kind of old melting pot school of thinking about American society. You turn instead to Lewis Wirth and others who have looked to persisting or recurring hyphenation for Jews, meaning a living in two worlds with participation in distinct social spheres and partaking in two distinct cultures. You suggest various drivers for Jews' hyphenation in the U.S., mostly social factors. I wonder, though, whether to understand and explain these phenomena better, we need one, more highly nuanced and flexible theoretical thinking in analyzing and categorizing the social and political relations at work, and to go beyond the analytic modes and categorization of social relations developed by the Chicago School and its heirs. And remember, the Chicago School had this marvelous habit of seeing dichotomies in social relations, primary group relations versus secondary groups. Nowadays, private versus public is a common distinction. Well, maybe those binaries are really too simple to capture the range of social experience and relationships. Secondly, I think we need to ask whether, compared to the social dynamics, we need to give more analytic weight to the actual beliefs and broader cultural traits which distinguish a minority group such as Jews from the rest of society in particular times and places. Socially driven models of ethnic change can otherwise treat the cultural traits all too easily as merely incidental matters. Okay, it's a black box that moves in a social context, and what's inside the cultural content inside the box is incidental sometimes. Now, perhaps that's a caricature of second-rate sociological arguments, and Chad, I'd be glad to hear a rebuttal to that implied accusation. For Sarah Hammerschlag, you raise fascinating issues about what Levinas, Neher, and Jankelevich considered to be the defining characteristics of their Jewishness and the relationship of Judaism to Christianity. Issues which I really must leave to those in the room who are better versed in French intellectual history of the post-1945 era than am I. Let me ask, though, I just set you up, I've got something to ask, okay? Let me ask, though, whether any who participated in the colloque believed that the Jews of France at large faced the same options and dilemmas in being Jews and Frenchmen as did the French intellectuals. Or did the intellectuals of the colloque see the larger body of French Jews as facing different conditions, particularly as traditional Jewish religious belief and practice may have been more vital realities for some of them than for the intellectuals. And the colloque was about the situation of the French Jewish intellectuals. Does not initially pretend to be talking about all French Jews, if I understand the project. Secondly, did any participants in the colloque bring to bear any social analysis in their thinking about the situation and identities of French Jewish intellectuals, perhaps drawing, not accidentally, on the rich traditions of 20th century French sociology, French anthropology, and French Marxist social thought? And maybe we should bring up some chairs so we can have a real panel.
I don't know how to arrange.
Just pull this back.
So why don't we have Chad and Sarah make the original or first responses to Gary, and then we'll open up to the room for a broader discussion. I just have one request, that if you want to pose a question or make a remark, please identify yourself, since we don't all know each other. So, Chad, would you like to start?
Sure. So it's hard to know where to start, because both Sarah's talk has sort of given us a lot to think about, and the response has also given us a lot to think about. I'm not sure that I can respond to everything in these remarks, but maybe sort of one place to start maybe. So the point about social and political relations, I think, is well taken. So of course, one of the criticisms that has long been made of the first Chicago school was that they tended to ignore political forces and political dynamics. And I think that I should say that I'm among other things a political sociologist, so I have to agree with this point about political relations. I think political relations are important. I think some of the things that Louis Wirth stressed in his book The Ghetto, although they weren't conceptualized as political, definitely had a political dimension then, and certainly have a political dimension now. So anti-Semitism, I think, can, has to be understood in partly political terms. Immigration and immigration policy has to be understood in partly political terms. So there is a way in which I think that old Chicago school stuff remains valuable and useful, though it does need to be sort of opened up and expanded. And one thing, maybe one other thing that I would say about the politics in the Chicago school, one of the arguments that I've tried to make recently is that I think that the key figures in the first Chicago school, Robert Park and Louis Wirth, have been misunderstood in terms of being seen as assimilationists and again lacking a political dimension in thinking. So there is a political dimension there, but it needs to be sort of brought to the surface, made explicit and developed. And I think that political dimension is that when they wrote about minority-majority relations, they were writing in the context of forming a broader democratic public in American society in the progressive era and in the interwar years. And I think that way of framing things has been lost in subsequent interpretations or receptions of their work. And I think it's worth bringing back in, not only for how we understand their work, but also for addressing the broader questions of the conference. So maybe I'll stop there as a kind of commercial.
I think I want to answer your question actually by going back to this conversation that was tracked in the paper between Levinas and Sal Levin, who was the cultural attaché of Israel, because in some sense he wants to make of the colloque exactly what you're suggesting, a kind of more capacious project, or he wants to use his audience to say like, okay, we can't use religion or ethnicity or race as a means to define Judaism. In fact, we need to collect this extraordinary number of individuals from extraordinarily different circumstances. And he wants to find a means to do that that in some sense isn't thematic. And so this proposal of an order is in some sense, he's playing a political role at that moment to try to say like, okay, look, Israel can in fact be this grab bag for all of these different kinds of experiences. And that makes Levinas furious. And there's this sort of moment in which you can, I mean, at least I feel it when I'm reading the transcript, in which he just snaps. And that's exactly what he doesn't want the colloque to be, and it's exactly what he doesn't want Judaism to be. And he says, you're talking about some approach that's like a museum approach. You think that we can just grab from here and grab from there, and that's Judaism? And that's because he's so already predetermined what he thinks his project needs to be. And it's so much about going back to the texts of the rabbinic period, going back to Talmudic texts and Midrashic texts, and using them also to go back to biblical texts, and to claim out of it this lens that, through this history, in some sense, this lens that can be cast onto the current moment. And so there is already a kind of philosophical / religious project, I think, and he is nervous about the colloque becoming something else, because of course in 1957 it could have been anything. None of them knew exactly what it was going to be. And there are people who come in and out of the door of the project. So Robbie is an interesting figure for me because he is a kind of down-to-earth gadfly type who is always trying to use concrete empirical evidence against the sort of theoretical vantage point of his interlocutors. But the mainstays of the colloque are really Levinas, Neher, and Leon Ashkenazi, and they are always going back to biblical text, and in some sense crafting in their own different ways a kind of religious version of what the colloque will do. So I think in some sense there's a contestation over what being a Jewish intellectual will mean. I think that in many ways, I mean, Levinas is clearly in some sense the one whose legacy had the greatest power. And he, I think, is the most committed to a certain idea of what the colloque will be. But what it does from year to year is it tries to address contemporary political issues, but in some sense to do it obliquely. So, you know, in 1968, the theme is jeunesse. It's like, it's the youth, right? Because there's just been revolts, right? So it's like, and so you see at every moment that you can find the sort of political coordinate. But I think what does, at least through the late 60s, when a bunch of its participators drop off, mostly because many of them make aliyah, there is a common desire to make the tradition speak to the present day. And in some sense, there's some sense in which you can only do that if it's a font of wisdom rather than a sort of means to collecting different forms of experience.
There's no interest of any of them in defining, looking at the texts, to find an argument to define what it is to be a Jew and what Judaism is as a matter of daily practice and honoring the commandments.
No, I mean, I think that appears here and there, but I would say practice is definitely, it's much more textually focused. Certainly those figures who are mainstays are always turning to text. Yeah, there's not a lot of analysis of ritual in these volumes.
Yeah, because but if you deny Judaism is a religion, a body of belief, then practice can be, if you could, it's one tempting alternative. But that's not, they don't go there.
But that's partly what's at stake in my paper, which I think is so interesting, is that in some sense they start by saying, no, we're not about belief. We're not like Christianity. It's not about dogma. And then in some sense they end up right back trying to find the dogmatic principles they can use to speak to the present day. And so there's an irony actually in the way in which a certain, if you call it belief, or you can call it a sort of ideational quality, that these are the things that end up taking the focus of the colloque, even if they begin insofar as they want to resist being defined by the dominant culture and trying to define Judaism against that version of Judaism.
I think I see Bruno.
Yeah. If I may. So I don't know if it's a question or a comment, but I've noticed that when we talk about hyphenation, we've been talking in terms of space, in terms of words. I started with geometry and with one dimension and so on and so forth. But I think that there is another aspect where subjectivity can implode much more than in belonging to two words, and it's the temporal. Right? And so it's when we are, I think there is a wonderful phrase by Kafka, but I don't know what it is in German, it's about having les pattes de devant qui sont déjà dans le nouveau monde, et the new world, and the pattes de derrière qui sont encore derrière. So this sort of diachronicity seems to me much more provoking or triggering of, you talk about something dramatic, about suicide or the possibility of imploding, sort of subjectivity that completely implodes. But I think that's where we are seeing more of that risk. And if you think about what anthropologists, psychoanalysts are writing today about young Muslim radicals, for example, in Europe, etc., who are identifying with against modernity or try to define themselves against modernity in the same way as the anti-modernism. So anyway, so you know what is the question? Then okay, I stop here. So I have a question for you.
Maybe in a very Jewish way, I'll respond to your question with a question. So this is interesting, Bruno, but what would a diachronic conception of hyphenation be other than what I mentioned at the beginning, this idea that hyphenation is a way station toward something else, which is more stable? Do you have something different in mind, or is that more or less what you have in mind as well?
No, I'm just thinking loudly because we still think in terms of space only when we talk about this. But there is the tradition or the appartenance, so to speak, of something which is older and that is in conflict or can be in conflict with modernity. And this is what we see also with the French republicanism. This is what we see maybe with Christianity and Judaism in the situation of out of history or in history. It's a sort of Hegelian perspective, right? But Christianity is in history in this world where the Jews are outside of history. It's a very Hegelian. So anyway, there is this temporal aspect which I think would be interesting.
I mean, I think actually I didn't pull it out, I mean, maybe I didn't emphasize enough in the paper, but all the language of these interlocutors is about past, present, and future.
Yeah, anyway, thanks a lot for this inspiring. Maybe I respond. I'm Vivian Dispa.
Yes. And we will hear from you later as well. Thank you. Yes.
I don't know if one can separate the temporal and the geographical, because very often it is through being hyphenated something that you bring words that live in different times together. But I would agree with you that where the real difficulty comes from, at the level that you described, leading all the way to suicide, would rather be in terms of conflicts in past, future, past, present, future, and tradition and modernity, rather than the hyphenated belongings. I was surprised. I would like to know more about. Is there the quote that you gave, Kafka? The next sentence is the despair that follows. So being with one's hind legs still in an old world, and the front legs have not found ground yet. The despair that follows is our inspiration. So that, and that goes exactly, that confirms absolutely the ending. But it is, so I think that
which text is that?
it's in one of his notes. It's not in a, but so Kafka being a Jew in Prague speaking German, and so the hyphen there, I don't think that that is what he would describe as a source of hardship, of despair. The despair would rather come from being nowhere in terms of modernity and tradition, having lost the tradition and not knowing yet where to go. And I wonder whether, as a question to you, whether there is really that kind of hardship, at least today in double loyalties, unless when it is criticized, but intrinsically, where would you locate that?
Well, I guess I would say that, well, I'll give you an example, actually. An example, sort of drawn from my own campus and my own university and students at mid-campus. So last year or 2 years ago, there was a controversy among the students at the University of Wisconsin. The student government wanted to pass a resolution that was a political resolution, so going back within politics again, it was a kind of omnibus political resolution, sort of condemning a whole host of sort of things that the student government found egregious and that they felt the students should be on record as objecting to. There was a section in the document that singled out Israel and Zionism. And so there were a lot of Jewish students who I know who were involved in this controversy who sympathized actually with a lot of the document. They wanted to support the document. They themselves, they thought of themselves as good progressives or leftists or whatever that might mean. But they found themselves being put in a situation of feeling like they had dual loyalties, I think, because what they were told basically is that they couldn't oppose this one part of the document. It was sort of take it or leave it. So either you're with us all the way, or you're not really a good progressive. And I witnessed some of the debates among the students, and they were quite acrimonious. And I talked to some of the students. Some of the students I knew, some of the Jewish students, and I feel like they really were pained because they sort of felt that they were really torn between two worlds in the sense that they wanted to be part of a student left on campus. They sort of saw themselves that way, but they also felt like they couldn't be and they weren't permitted to be part of this left. So that's a very concrete example to
I wonder if what you describe is really an issue of the hyphen, because what you describe is something that is so familiar also among, let's say, Israelis who wouldn't be hyphenated, just, to, on the one hand...
It can also be articulated in terms of temporality, because you can see people who are like pro-Israel as people who are backward, in a way,
Right.
because
Yeah.
they stick to the nation state.
Right.
Whereas people who are progressive are beyond already the nation state, sort of post-national type of. So I think there is also a clash again of temporality.
I think I'll intervene because there's, I've seen two. Within a few minutes, we can continue our conversation to Neil.
Sure. Two quick questions. I'm Shaul Magi. Actually, I would love to kind of continue this line of thought, but I wanted to ask Chad and Sarah two questions. One is, I was wondering, Chad, in your listening to your remarks, how much of this all has to do with race. And I kept thinking of Kevin Schultz's Trying Faith America, and the way in which the question for the American Jew is really less one of hyphen and more one of whiteness, or at least whiteness plays an important role in how to define the hyphen. And more generally, just for the conference, is, the interesting thing is that Jews generally don't define themselves through a hyphen. We're not Jewish Americans, American Jews.
Yeah.
Right? So the hyphen doesn't even exist in the self-identification, whereas it does in other ethnic minorities. Italian Americans, Irish Americans, Asian Americans, African Americans, and then American Jews. So somewhat Jewish Americans sound somewhat dissonant.
But American Jews puts the emphasis on the Jewish part much more than you would find other groups.
Yes, look, I think that's precisely what I'd love for you to address in terms of where is the hyphen for American Jewry exactly. And I do think it seems to me to be race seems to play an important role, because in that tri-faith America, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, that's a tri-faith America that's white. It's not the African American Protestant. It's the white Protestant, the white Catholic, and the white Jew. That's what Schultz is talking about in his work. So maybe to tease out the race thing, and the Sarah, I mean, I always kind of like, it always makes me somehow feel incredulous to listen to Andre Neher and other people sitting there in an intellectual environment, speaking totally in Western Christianized categories, talking about the purity of Judaism. I mean, what are they, what are they actually talking about? The fantasy of purity, and I think that Levinas slips into it, but he also resists it. Like he knows what he's doing, but some of those other French intellectuals, when they move in that direction, I mean, there are other people, this guy named Ben Sasson, who was a French intellectual of that, so he wasn't in the Colloque, but of that circle, who then leaves and becomes a Breslover Chassid. So that I can understand, right? I understand the French just saying, yeah, I actually want to embody or live out this purity. But for Neher, I don't know, there's something that just seems to me just missing.
You have some brief response.
Okay, I'll stop.
Thank you.
So the thing about race, I think, is interesting. My brief response would be that I know that this is really quite fashionable these days to sort of, I would say, subsume questions about Jews and Gentiles or about anti-Semitism within that framework, within that frame of reference. And I would resist that a little bit because I've written a bit about this, that I think very often these questions and these categories get squeezed into conceptual frames, which I think ends up distorting more than it ends up illuminating. So, the sorts of things that we've been discussing this afternoon, where religion has been a category that I think has sort of been at the forefront, or other kinds of categories. I don't see a reason to subordinate those to another set of categories necessarily. So it's not that the question of race is irrelevant here. It's certainly relevant to white nationalism. But what I resist is sort of again sort of subsuming, if I put it simplistically, subsuming the Jewish question into a question about whiteness or about race. I think it's more complicated.
Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what interests me about this project is that I think I share your incredulity sometimes when I read Neher and Leon Ashkenazi, and it's a kind of fascination for what I don't understand that I find interesting. But I do think that another answer to it is the fact that both of them did actually end up being a follower of Rav Kook, they both made Aliyah, and they both embraced a certain version of religious Zionism. And I think that in one version of why that was that in some sense there was no way in which the way they were reading texts would make sense insofar as they continued to try to understand themselves as French Jewish intellectuals. And Ashkenazi went so far to insist that he was not Jewish anymore, he was Hebrew. So I think they were struggling with that same question themselves. But that doesn't, for me, change my incredulity in the sense that I don't understand. I mean, so Ashkenazi, I mean, we could talk about it here too, but Ashkenazi, for example, has essays in which he essentially wants to extract philosophy from Judaism. And he wants to claim that like all the Jewish philosophers were basically traitors in some sense because philosophy is a Western imposition. And so this sort of desire to just pull, it's like an impossible tearing apart. And it's wounding in the sense that what's left, I find distressing in its implications and sometimes intellectually bankrupt, to be honest. And yet, it's not as though they don't have numerous followers, even still, people devoted to their projects. Certainly Levinas's own sort of interwoven understanding of Judaism philosophy has more intellectual credence and is certainly translated globally in a way that neither Meher's work or Ashkenazi has. But I think that the conversation is taking place speaks to a kind of crisis that the war brought on in terms of like the desire to divest oneself from this oppressive culture.
We have time for one more question or comment before we move on to our dinner. So, do you have anything?
Very brief, and I hate to bring us back to the question before. My name is Imogen Page. I was recently an undergraduate here. And I wonder if the dual loyalty, which was originally weaponized against Jews by European governments and so on, if you are putting it on those leftist campus movements, when in fact it should in this case, having been part of some of those campus fights myself, when in fact it should be put on, on the Zionist project. Is it different when dual loyalty is leveraged against Jews by other Jews, as opposed to by, the state that we live in, is left?
My short answer to that would be I think it's an objectionable and problematic maneuver regardless of where it comes from politically.
Well, I want to thank our speakers, our respondents, everyone here in the room, and welcome you. I guess I'm the person who's meant to tell you that Dale Shepherd Room is in that direction, where we will continue our really stimulating conversation, and then await our keynote speakers tonight.